Hello everyone, my name is Alex, and today I will be discussing the ethical issues and impact that coffee and chocolate has on the environment. But first, let's talk about the history of chocolate and coffee. The actual origin of each is actually hard to trace and pinpoint, as there are a lot of conflicting stories. I'll just be telling you the stories that are most commonly referred to. The story of coffee came about in Ethiopia, when a goat herder named Kaldi saw his goats eat a certain berry from a tree. The goats became noticeably more energized and awake as much as to not being able to sleep at night. Kaldi reported these findings to his local monastery and developed a drink out of these berries. This drink would have a similar effect on him and kept him alert through hours of prayer. The knowledge of these berries began to spread as it reached across the globe. Coffee became the tradition in the Arabian Peninsula and then onto Europe, where coffee became the normal drinking preference for breakfast, as starting the day energized would lead to more productivity. However, tea was still the New World's most popular drink. Then in 1773, Americans revolted on the British tax on tea, which led to the Boston Tea Party and solidified that coffee was America's drinking preference. Now, as for chocolate, it was discovered by the ancient Olmecs at around 1500 BC, in which they were used for a ceremonial drink. However, it is debated whether the cacao beans or the pulp from the cacao pod was used for the drink. When the Olmecs told the Mayans, they started making chocolate drinks to finalize important transactions and ate it as a part of a lot of meals. Then the Aztecs thought it was a godsend, as the upper class would treat chocolate as more valuable than gold, and started using chocolate as a currency. Now let's talk about the issues that the discovery and popularity has led to, starting with coffee. As I mentioned before, coffee became the norm for a drinking preference at breakfast, and over time, coffee beans and product would need to be mass produced. In order to mass produce, production needs to be quicker than it already was. Coffee is traditionally shade grown, as it would grow at a slower pace, require less water, and use less pesticides. It would also maintain the habitats for many forest species, which means support for greater biodiversity. However, mass production does lead to a change in the methods. Sun-grown coffee became the new process for farmers, which is the exact opposite of tradition. This would require more water, fertilizer, and pesticides. The removal of trees leads to eliminating shade, as well as habitat and biodiversity. This trend of sun-grown coffee would lead to a lot of deforestation to where it gets somewhat out of hand. In Central America, 2.5 million of acres of forest was cleared in order to make way for sun-grown coffee. The link is stronger than Central America, as 37 out of 50 countries with the highest deforestation rates are also coffee producing. This deforestation trend puts biodiversity in these regions at severe risk, as the loss of plants would lead to a loss of bugs and animals. Sun-grown coffee doesn't just have an effect on biodiversity, as it also affects humans and the river system. Removing shade away from the vegetation can significantly alter the way soil enriches and prevent it from growing. The waste produced by a coffee plantation, when they separate the product from the excess, is eventually negligently thrown away as waste. This lack of care for waste eventually leads to a polluted water system that could affect the residential areas nearby. For a 6-month period in 1988, Central America was processing 547,000 tons of coffee and 1.1 million tons of pulp, which led to polluting 110,000 cubic meters of water each day. Contaminating the water leads to the soil suffering in quality, and this is largely in part to the sun growing methods. Let's move on to how ethical coffee production is. Firstly, let's talk a little bit about fair trade. Fair trade is a nonprofit third party who sets standards on how farmers should be compensated and treated based off working conditions. Think of them as the ethics police or the Better Business Bureau for plantations. However, I will discuss this topic further in later slides. Without fair trade, the handling of coffee businesses and the farmers who supply them is called direct trade. Direct trading is built off actual relationships with the producers with equal distribution brought by the value of coffee, which breaks down the prices for farmers. The handling of equity for direct traders is based on how they themselves handle it, rather than a third party who regulates how the product is made and workers are treated. The problem with direct trade is that the workers on the farm are often exploited through long hours and poor working conditions. They often earn less than the monthly minimum wage, which they would have to use to provide for their family. It is often compared to slavery, as they continuously struggle to make ends meet. Farmers would be forced onto the fields rather than pursuing an education. It is also worrisome that coffee is the top industry that uses child slaves for production, especially in Colombia and Guatemala, according to EcoCult. From a consumer's perspective, it is up to them to factor the unethical conditions and practices to the workers and the environment that arise from coffee production. For instance, when a consumer buys coffee, do they see themselves as supporting the conditions or the product? Does the consumer adhere to the environmental impact and degradation to forests, water system, and soil? The producer and coffee companies would keep these practices as long as sales for their production keeps rolling in. Now let's talk about the same issues chocolate would separately have to the environment. Chocolate actually takes large amounts of water to produce. For just one chocolate bar, it would need 1,000 liters of water. Chocolate production also contributes to air pollution as the chocolate industry in the UK produces 2.1 million tons of greenhouse gases in a year. This is through natural course of production as the raw material is used and the packaging is a major environmental hazard. More greenhouse gases in the atmosphere which would require more trees to convert these into oxygen. However, the exact opposite is being done with the forests that are being chopped down. The chocolate company is also doing very little to combat deforestation and switching to sustainable chocolate. Mars Inc., one of the biggest chocolate companies, made a vow to switching to sustainable cocoa, but this vow proved to be ineffective as in 2017, 40 football fields worth of forests were being cut down by the minute. The cocoa production has a lot to answer for in terms of deforestation, as 70% of West Africa's illegal deforestation is related to cocoa production. There has been a lot of contributors to the decrease in forests, which also includes wildfires. The Ivory Coast lost up to 80% of its forests in the past 50 years, and Ghana has lost a forest that was the size of New Jersey. The loss of forests is also a loss in decreasing the air pollution, as not enough trees are storing carbon dioxide and releasing oxygen. Mars Inc. has historically not been able to keep up with environmental deadlines, and they constantly push back their goals. Despite chocolate companies making a vow to eradicate child labor nearly 20 years ago, it is no secret that chocolate producers still utilize and take advantage of children in order to access cheaper labor. In the Ivory Coast and Ghana, 2 million children are exposed to hazardous conditions involving cocoa farming. Kids as young as 12 would have been victimized in human trafficking in order to swing a machete in the cocoa fields. The eradication of child labor is hardly even seen, as there has been an increase in child labor by 14% in the past decade, and the cocoa production has increased by 62% in that same period. So not only is there more child labor, those children are forced into working even harder. Chocolate companies gave their producers many deadlines such as 2005, 2008, 2010, and 2020 to uproot child labor, and they have not come close to eradicating it. These companies also have hidden their actual production plants, so the consumers were unable to trace the farms and whether child labor was utilized. The children's hopes of going to school has led to getting paid 85 cents a day and becoming malnourished. Now I will explain what Fair Trade exactly is. As I mentioned before, Fair Trade USA are unbiased third-party auditors who evaluate the performance and compliance with the standards. They made sure the factory, its workers, as well as the product were treated in a manner deemed ethical. There are also other reputable ethical standard setters such as West Elm and Nest. This was started in the 1950s when Europeans and Americans observed artisans and farmers struggling to make ends meet as travelers would buy and sell their item for a marked up price. Those artisans and farmers were not guaranteed any profits back. Fair Trade USA helped educate companies to sell more product and inform and educate consumers through their seal. The fair trade process takes 6 to 9 months and is renewed annually. Fair Trade USA sets a standard that helps farmers get a fair share for the product that they have sold. Some people have taken advantage of fair trade, and it does not always work, which is why critics would call it marketing malarkey. Fair trade is a system that is just complicated, and even if sometimes it does not work, the system is still there to deter unethical practices. Is there any way to ethically shop these products? To start, a fair trade certification is some sort of check into ethical treatment for those workers. There are many other certifications, so research them to see if they are trustworthy. Making sure the products you are buying are organic, and yes, it might look like a marketing ploy in order to attract healthy eaters. However, searching for purely organic foods is supporting products without the use of pesticides. Workers in the fields have to work in conditions of inhaling pesticides all day. Also, supporting coffee that is shade grown to support good environmental practices and habits goes a long way as to show where your money supports. Thank you for listening to my presentation, and I hope you have a more informed decision when you purchase coffee or chocolate. And here are my sources.